I've always liked secondhand things, not because we couldn't afford new ones, but because they had stories attached. A chair with a scratch, a book with someone else's notes in the margin, a camera that still smelled faintly of film. I thought those traces were harmless. Then there was the suitcase. It was a Saturday evening, early autumn, around the time when daylight fades before you notice. Rachel and I were walking back from the grocery store, talking about dinner, nothing important. Our apartment complex has this fenced area near the back where residents leave bulky waste. Usually it's broken shelves, old mattresses, the sort of stuff that looks tired even from a distance. That night something stood out. A violet hard-shell suitcase, upright, handle extended, like someone had placed it there carefully rather than tossed it away. Rachel stopped first. "Looks expensive," she said. It did. The metal corners were polished, the wheels unscuffed. Whoever owned it last had taken care of it. We looked around. No one else was near. I gave the handle a pull. It moved smoothly, heavier than I expected, but not impossibly so. There was a faint smell, old fabric, and a trace of damp. Nothing alarming. The rule here is simple. Once it's in the disposal zone, anyone can take it. I'd salvaged a blender once, worked perfectly after cleaning. I figured this could be the same. We brought it upstairs. I set it by the balcony door while Rachel unlocked the groceries. The smell grew a little stronger in the warmth of the apartment, so she suggested leaving it outside overnight to air out. I agreed. I remember the way the balcony light caught the surface, small scratches glinting like veins on metal. That was all it was to us then, a lucky find. The next morning, while I was at work, Rachel called. She doesn't usually call during the day unless something's wrong. Her voice was low, controlled. She said a man was standing near the dumpster, facing our direction, not moving. She thought he might be looking for something he'd lost. I told her to stay inside and close the curtains. We joked lightly, tried to make it sound unimportant, but I could hear in the pause between her words that she was watching him carefully. After a while, she said he'd walked off toward the street and hung up. When I came home that evening, the air inside smelled faintly chemical from the cleaning spray she'd used. The suitcase was still on the balcony, untouched. I told her the man probably lived in another building. She nodded, not convinced but willing to let it go. 2 days later, she decided to clean the suitcase properly. She unzipped it on the kitchen floor while I was sorting receipts. I remember the sound, the zipper catching halfway, then sliding free. The inside was plain gray fabric, smooth, no stains. Only a small patch near one corner looked newer, stitched with darker thread as if someone had repaired a tear. She wiped everything down with disinfectant and left it to dry. There was nothing unusual except the smell. It didn't vanish completely, just dulled, like something you'd notice only when you got too close. That weekend, we planned a short trip to the coast, just a night away. Rachel packed our clothes into the suitcase because it was lighter and rolled better than our old one. She smiled about it, said maybe it really was a good find. I helped load the car, thinking about the man by the dumpster but not enough to mention it. We reached the motel late. While unpacking, Rachel stopped. She had pulled a long dark strand of hair from the zipper, too long to be hers, darker. She stared at it, then at me. I said maybe it had been trapped in the lining. She didn't argue, just kept pulling clothes out, checking each one like she was looking for more. The air conditioner rattled above us, and the smell that came from the suitcase mixed with the motel's detergent scent. We decided to get rid of it when we got home. It wasn't a big decision, more like closing a drawer. Sunday evening, the parking lot was quiet when we returned. I opened the door, stepped inside, and felt something off before I could name it. The hallway light was on. It shouldn't have been. Drawers were open, clothes half pulled out. The kitchen table was shifted away from the wall. Nothing stolen. Wallets, jewelry, electronics, all where we'd left them. But the drawers looked searched. Someone had been deliberate. The police arrived 20 minutes later. They took photographs, dusted powder over handles, Asked if we'd noticed anyone suspicious. I mentioned the man outside earlier in the week and the suitcase from the dumpster. One of them, a younger officer, raised his eyebrows but said nothing. After they left, the apartment felt smaller. Rachel sat on the couch holding the TV remote like she wasn't sure what to do with her hands. We argued briefly about staying somewhere else that night, then ended up sleeping there anyway because we were too tired to move. The next morning she insisted we return the suitcase. I didn't argue. We carried it back to the disposal area before work, set it exactly where we'd found it, handle upright. No one saw us. Walking away, I remember thinking how ordinary it looked among the broken chairs and old fans. By afternoon, it was gone. A week later, the property office sent a printed warning about unauthorized removal of discarded items. A photo from the security camera showed me dragging the suitcase across the pavement. They must have checked footage after the break-in. The letter ended with "Further incidents will be reported to authorities." I put it in a drawer and forgot about it until Detective Lane called. He said our address had come up in an ongoing investigation involving a suitcase found in another neighborhood. He asked to confirm a few details: color, make, when we'd picked it up, when we'd returned it. His tone was polite, routine. I told him everything, down to the smell and the hair. He didn't react, just said he'd be in touch. News broke 3 days later. A body had been discovered in a black suitcase behind a row of townhouses 5 blocks from here. The article was short: "One suspect in custody, cause of death pending autopsy." I read it twice, then a third time, because the description of the container, the brand, the model, matched ours. Different color, same series. I showed it to Rachel. She read it without speaking, folded the page, placed it on the counter. We didn't talk about it that night. The next day, police cars were parked near the dumpsters again. They took measurements, photos, notes. I watched from the balcony. One of the officers looked up, saw me, gave a brief nod. That gesture replaced any conversation. We were part of the paperwork now, another reference point in someone else's case file. Detective Lane visited once more. He brought printouts from CCTV. The first frame showed me with the suitcase. The second showed another man later that same evening, the hooded one Rachel had described, standing near the same spot. The timestamps were 20 minutes apart. Lane asked if I recognized him. I said no, but Rachel's face told me she wasn't sure. The posture looked too familiar. He left us with a copy of the report and a request to call if we remembered anything new. Days turned to weeks. The story faded from headlines but stayed local rumor. People whispered in the elevators about that couple with a suitcase. The maintenance staff avoided eye contact. At work, I caught myself replaying the sound of the zipper, wondering if it had stuck because something was wedged beneath. I never said that aloud. Every routine we had adjusted itself around what happened. I checked locks twice before bed. Rachel started keeping a notebook of times, calls, noises, deliveries. The apartment remained quiet, but the quiet meant something different now. It wasn't peace. It was waiting. That was the beginning. Nothing strange, nothing supernatural, just a thing we found, and what followed because of it. That was the beginning. The next step was paperwork and people with pens who made a map out of ordinary life. Detective Lane called a few days after the news item. He asked for dates and times, what we'd moved, when the suitcase had been returned. He used plain language and avoided speculation. I told him when Rachel had first noticed the man by the dumpster, what time we'd put the case back, and that we had photography from the property notice. He asked if we could come down to the station to look at some stills. He said it was routine. I went in the afternoon and brought the printed photo from the property office because it had the timestamp and showed me moving the suitcase. Lane had a stack of images on the table, all grainy frames from different cameras. He pointed out one with a figure bending near the edge of the disposal pile, then another with a man walking away with something tucked under his arm. He marked times on the margin and asked me to identify whether any of the angles showed our building clearly. I nodded at the frames that did. On the way back, the city felt like it did on a regular weekday. People moved with a list of tasks. Around the building, management had taped a temporary surveillance notice. Someone in the complex mentioned it in passing by the mailboxes and then looked away. Routine again. Inside our apartment, Rachel had spread a logbook across the kitchen table. Phone calls, officer names, dates of visits. She wrote neatly, no note about what she thought, just the facts. In the drawer where we kept manuals and receipts, I added the printout Lane had given me and a photograph of the suitcase before we'd returned it. The documents fit together like pieces in a ledger. Detective Lane's next visit came with a question about fiber transfers. He explained that fibers can move more easily than you think, by touch, by rolling, by whatever passes over a surface. He showed a lab result, traces of household fiber matching the general weave of our living room rug on adhesive residue recovered from the case found behind the townhouses. He did not say ours were the only fibers. He said ours were consistent with their lab's findings. That was the technical language they use. Consistent, not conclusive, part of a pattern. I answered his questions about where the suitcase had been moved inside the apartment and whether we'd carried it across the rug. I said yes. For weeks, the inquiry had the feel of a machine, grinding slowly. Officers came through and measured once, then again, took photographs of the disposal area and the path from there to the street. The maintenance supervisors showed detectives the clipboard entries noting bulky waste pickups and the schedule of contracted haulers. Lane asked the supervisors at the municipal facility about the load that had come in the day the violet suitcase left the disposal area. The paperwork showed a pickup, a truck number, a processing time. The trail ended where municipal protocols allowed it to end. Neighbors stopped leaving items for pickup without tags. People began to check the dumpster before dropping things off. It was small behavior, functional, and it spread the same way a memo spreads in an office. Someone does it, someone else notices, then someone else copies it, because copying costs less than thinking. Our building's front office handled a handful of calls from residents who had seen men linger by the lot. The descriptions varied slightly: thin, hoodie, dark jacket, enough to be useful only to an extent. Lane compiled those accounts, noting times and any corroboration. His notes read like a log: 10:15 p.m. Witness A saw male subject. 10:45 p.m. Surveillance picks up vehicle X near site. At work, the case sat on my desk as a background noise. People asked how we were, made the polite half-step toward sympathy, and then closed the space with a change of subject. I answered the questions with the same cadence I used for other updates I gave in life. The name of the detective, the case number, the time frame. When the lab called to say they'd completed an analysis of fibers and some matched to the city exhibit, Lane followed up in person to explain what that meant procedurally. He didn't dramatize. He explained exhibits, handling, what a match implied and what it didn't. He left his card and asked us to list any other items we might have moved that week. I made that list. When an arrest was made, the news came in a flat bulletin. A man in his 30s had been taken into custody in another part of the city. The police did not immediately tie that arrest to every piece of evidence. Their press release mentioned evidence secured, including 2 suitcases. The station ran the facts without flourish. We watched the updates with the same dry attention we give to weather thumbnails. Useful, actionable, then gone. Lane called the day after the arrest to confirm collection dates and to ask if we had receipts or witnesses who might testify about the identity of the suitcase. We sent copies of the property notice and the printed photo. The legal process began to outline itself on a calendar that sat on the dining table. Dates for preliminary hearings appeared, then a notation that the defense had requested discovery. Lane explained in another phone call that discovery would include a list of exhibits, and that if the violet suitcase turned up as a linked item, they would notify us. He also said that often items move through municipal systems and sometimes are destroyed according to policy. Sometimes they are retained as evidence. He used the word sometimes without emotion. If anything changed in our daily routine after that, it was in how we cataloged things. We labeled suitcases inside with small adhesive tags labeled with dates. We photographed any bulky item we brought into the apartment. Rachel kept the log in a folder that we could hand over easily if asked. The pattern was not fear so much as administrative caution. It made future conversations simpler. Show the photograph, point to the timestamp, refer to the log. Practical actions replaced speculation. There were procedural moments that stuck, details entirely procedural. Lane requesting chain of custody forms. A municipal worker bringing in a list of trucks and the load manifests. Screen grabs in an email showing footage of a street corner where a dark object is placed near a hedge and then taken away. Each item slid into place in the investigation like coordinates. Lane explained how individual observations build a grid. A person saw this at 6:47. A truck was logged at 7:02. A CCTV camera at 7:15 captured a vehicle making a turn. Those markers become the skeleton of an account that they can present to a court if necessary. Neighbors offered statements that came and went, some consistent enough to be useful and others too vague to hold. One neighbor remembered a man in a hoodie walking a dog and pausing by the disposal area. Another pointed to a delivery van that had been staged near the alley that week. Lane took those statements and converted them to timestamps, then matched them to municipal logs and third-party camera files. Evidence, in his office, was finite and specific. Testimony was probabilistic and useful only in aggregates. Months passed and technical jargon collected like dust on the files. Discovery motions came and were answered. The name of the person arrested appeared in public records tied to the charges, and court dates were set and deferred in the way legal calendars do. Lane would call to update us when there was something discreet. A new lab result, a hearing date, a request for additional information. When he asked whether we could testify to having seen the man in the gray hoodie on a particular date, I confirmed the time and described how I had moved the case across the lot. I gave him the facts as clearly as I could. Date, time, photos, the property notice with its printed frame. There were administrative mismatches. A municipal record showed a load from the disposal area that was logged with a different truck number than the one the hauler registered to the processing site. Lane filed a request for the hauler's manifest and spoke with municipal records to reconcile the entries. The discrepancies are normal. They are the gaps investigators expect to have to close by cross-verification. Lane's office coordinated across those practical silos. He wrote memos, followed leads through bureaucratic channels, and periodically updated the file with findings that did not change the larger arc but reduced uncertainty. At home, the log became part of how we organized the week. I would add a line when I drove the car into the garage after work. Rachel would jot a timestamp of a maintenance visit. Small, discrete records. We stopped leaving anything valuable on the balcony. The disposal area got a new sign and a lock that required office authorization to open. Residents complained for a day and then resumed patterns that avoided inconvenience. The building installed an additional camera that recorded to a secure server, and someone from management walked through the building's common areas to verify the angle and field of view. As late winter moved toward early spring, the prosecution filed preliminary documents and the court listed exhibits. Some identified by serial numbers, others by descriptive tags. Lane left a message saying they were cataloging exhibits and if anything from our household might match descriptions in the list to notify him. I checked the folder on the dining table where we kept the printed photos and property notices and added a note with the case number and the detective's phone. Administrative steps stack up in a file the same way physical items stack in a disposal area. There was no drama in the process when the case moved ahead. Only steps completed and forms filed. The material world continued according to its ordinary schedules: trash pickups, mail delivery, maintenance rounds. The investigation followed its own schedules. Pieces were moved from site to site, from municipal facility to evidence locker, and the case file grew in inches of paper. Those pages are what the system uses to explain itself. They are the way a public process records private incidents. Lane's updates continued to be technical, a sequence of status points. One morning, a mailer arrived from the municipal waste office with a notice about updated bulky item pickup procedures, and an apology for any inconvenience related to increased enforcement. It read like a bureaucratic afterthought, policy adjustments following a noteworthy incident. People talked for a day about the notice and then returned to whatever tasks they had. For us, the notice was another line to add to the log. When the defense submitted its discovery, Lane called to ask if I could be available for a deposition. He explained the process, how a deposition collects first-hand recollection and forms part of the record. I scheduled the time and prepared the folder with the printed photograph, property notice, phone records, and the log. The deposition was a sequence of questions and answers recorded by a court reporter. Its tone was methodical and devoid of the feeling of weight I might have expected. I answered in the same way I had with Lane throughout. Specific dates, precise movements, photographs, and where they were taken. That was the pattern of the months that followed. Administrative, document-driven, incremental. No dramatic moments, only the accumulation of accounted detail. The investigation continued as an apparatus made of paperwork, testimony, and the movement of objects through municipal systems. The suitcase, which had begun as a piece of discarded property, had become a node in that apparatus. The record of it sat in a file. The photographs were archived. The logs were updated. The next event was another procedural step. A hearing date was set for preliminary matters, and Lane left a message to say they would notify us of exhibit numbering and whether the violet suitcase matched any item listed as recovered. I made one more copy of the property notice, placed it in the folder, and brought the folder to the dining table. I closed it and slid it into the drawer so it would be ready if asked. The case proceeded along its mapped route without interruption. By early summer, the investigation had moved far enough that our part was limited to waiting for subpoenas. Lane called less often. When he did, the updates came in sentences short enough to fit in a notebook margin. The defendant had entered a plea. The prosecution was cataloging evidence. The violet suitcase was still unaccounted for in physical form, but remained referenced in reports as Container B. That phrase turned up in news briefs and on printed lists we received by mail. The day we were called for testimony began like any other. I went to work, left at noon, and met Lane outside the courthouse. He wore the same gray jacket as before and carried a folder thick with forms. Inside the courthouse, the hall smelled of old paper and floor wax. Courtrooms look the same wherever you go. Benches, flags, microphones that pick up the shuffle of every sleeve. When our turn came, the clerk swore me in and the prosecutor asked about dates, photographs, the discovery of the suitcase, and whether I had seen anyone remove it from the disposal area. My answers were factual, each sentence built on a date. No one objected, no one dramatized. The defense attorney asked whether I had ever opened the suitcase completely. I said yes, my wife had cleaned it. He asked if anything inside had looked unusual. I said no. That was the extent of my role. Rachel testified after me. She kept her eyes on the table and spoke clearly. The prosecutor asked about the hair she'd found, the smell, the break-in. She gave the same measured answers she'd rehearsed the night before. The questions lasted less than 20 minutes. When we stepped outside, Lane thanked us for coming and told us we'd probably hear nothing further unless the court requested clarification. His voice sounded practiced, not unkind. The case stretched for months after that. We followed it the way you follow weather on a long trip, checking now and then, noting changes. Headlines condensed to a few sentences. Defendant confesses to homicide in plea deal. Sentencing scheduled for late August. Each update reduced what had once filled our days to a footnote in a column of local news. At work, people stopped asking. The neighbors had new things to talk about. Renovations, school schedules, the noise from construction down the street. When sentencing came, the news broadcast used a photo of the courthouse steps and a single line, 30 years. The anchor read it with the same tone she used for everything else on the list. The segment lasted 12 seconds. I timed it once later, just to know how long the entire story of those months occupied in the public record. After the trial, we received an envelope from the police property office. Inside was a form letter thanking us for cooperation and stating that all personal items related to the case had been processed. Attached was a list of exhibits cleared for disposal. Container B was among them, marked destroyed per evidence policy. Section 14A. I placed the letter in the folder with the others. The folder had grown thicker than I realized. Life reformed around smaller details. Rachel stopped keeping the log. We left the notebook on the shelf where we stored manuals, not thrown away, just unused. The disposal area behind the building had new locks and a motion sensor light that came on every time someone approached. The gate shut automatically now. Sometimes, coming home late, I'd hear the soft clank as it latched behind another resident. The sound meant the system was working. One evening near the end of summer, a city inspector came by the building with a clipboard, checking each unit's smoke alarms and exits. When he reached our door, he glanced past me into the living room and pointed toward the balcony. "This the unit that had the evidence pickup?" I said yes. He nodded, made a note, and said the city was updating procedures for bulky item disposal. More tracking, more accountability. He didn't linger. The conversation took less than a minute. After he left, the apartment was silent again. Rachel went back to her old routines: morning coffee by the window, grocery lists on the counter, weekend drives when weather allowed. We didn't talk about the suitcase anymore, not because it was painful, but because it had become one of those subjects that existed only in files. The world had already processed it into paper, and paper doesn't require opinion. Still, certain habits stayed. I kept copies of utility bills, recorded maintenance visits, stored every receipt for repairs. Order replaced the sense of watchfulness we used to have. It was easier to track what you could measure. On weekends, I'd clear the balcony, sweep dust from the railings, wipe the glass door. Every once in a while, I'd catch the faint smell of cleaner and remember how strong it had been the day Rachel first opened that suitcase. Memory lives in scents more than words. In late September, a final notice arrived from the prosecutor's office. Case closed. The paper was thin, the ink almost gray. The line beneath our names said no further action required. I read it twice and filed it in the folder. The folder no longer needed to be on the table. I slid it into the cabinet where we keep tax records. Months later, a new family moved into the unit across the hall. The father nodded when we passed. The mother said hello. The child carried a toy plane. They asked once about bulky item disposal, and I told them about the new permit system. I didn't mention the old one. There was no reason to. Every building keeps its history in small details: the way paint layers over old stains, the way numbers fade on doors. If someone told the story years from now, they'd probably leave our names out. It would shrink to a cautionary paragraph in a safety manual or a municipal report. Residents unknowingly retrieved item later linked to evidence. No charges filed. That's how most things end when they leave the front page. The violet suitcase no longer exists anywhere except in documents. In the evidence list, it's a code. In memory, it's an object defined by weight and color. Sometimes, when I walk past the new disposal enclosure at night, I glance through the slats. People still leave things. Chairs, mirrors, boxes that once held something useful. The motion light clicks on, then off. The gate closes. I keep walking. At that point, the story had already become part of the city's quiet routine, collected, logged, archived, and forgotten by everyone except the few who had to sign their names under the lines that said they'd seen it. After the trial, I thought the paperwork would stop. It didn't. There's always another form to confirm that the previous one was received, another notice to acknowledge that the system has archived what it no longer needs. By the following winter, the case had turned into a reference number printed on official mail. Each envelope arrived with the same seal from the county clerk's office and the same sentence at the top: "For your records." One morning, a letter came marked "Follow-up Inquiry." Inside was a short paragraph explaining that an internal review was being conducted to assess how evidence from the case had been handled. They weren't accusing anyone of error, only verifying chain of custody. It was the kind of audit agencies do after a high-profile conviction. Still, seeing the name of the case again brought the quiet weight of repetition. I faxed back the confirmation page and thought that would be the end of it. 2 weeks later, Detective Lane called. His voice hadn't changed, measured, professional, but there was something slower about how he paused before certain words. He said they'd discovered inconsistencies in disposal logs. The violet suitcase might not have been destroyed on the date listed in the evidence report. It might have been transferred to a storage facility before destruction. He didn't sound alarmed. It was procedure. Sometimes, he said, records don't line up perfectly between departments. He asked whether we'd be willing to sign another statement verifying that we had relinquished possession of the suitcase at the property disposal area. I told him yes, of course. He said an officer would stop by to collect signatures and verify contact information. I hung up and wrote the date in the margin of the old folder. The officer arrived the next afternoon, clipboard in hand. She checked our IDs, wrote the time, asked a few quick questions about where the suitcase had been found and when it was returned. She thanked us and left. The exchange took maybe 5 minutes. The door closed and the apartment was quiet again. The kind of quiet that sounds like a clock without a second hand. A month passed without news. Then another envelope arrived. No seal this time, just a printed return address from the Municipal Evidence Storage Division. Inside was a notice that the violet suitcase had been located and logged correctly. The audit was complete. The case was considered fully closed. That should have been the last document. One evening in early March, I was carrying garbage out to the new locked enclosure. The wind was sharp and the air smelled like damp concrete. I slid my keycard into the reader. The gate clicked open, and I stepped inside. Everything was as it should be. Organized bins, signage, fluorescent light overhead. Then I noticed a city-issued evidence tag lying face down near the wall. It was a small laminated card, the kind used to mark recovered property. On the back, the printing had faded, but a line of text was still visible. Container B, Violet, property of County Evidence Unit. It was probably nothing. An old tag dropped from a worker's clipboard, a spare copy blown from a truck. Still, I picked it up and slipped it into my jacket pocket. It was thin, slightly warped, edges soft from humidity. When I got upstairs, I put it on the table beside the folder, intending to drop it off at the property office the next morning. That night, while sorting through receipts, I realized the tag number didn't match the one on our paperwork. It was close, only the last digit was different, but close enough that I noticed. Administrative errors happen. Lane had explained that more than once. I decided to leave a voicemail for him first thing in the morning. Before I could, he called. His message was short. The audit team had confirmed the suitcase's destruction. Any tags or materials found elsewhere were likely duplicates from internal testing. He thanked us again for our cooperation. I put the tag in an envelope and dropped it at the office for collection. The clerk behind the counter recognized the case name and said she'd forward it. Her tone was neutral. For her, it was just another document returning to the pile. Weeks rolled forward. Rachel replaced the old logbook with a new notebook meant for grocery lists. The folder stayed in the drawer, untouched. The air in the apartment had the plain smell of soap and coffee. In April, Lane called one last time. He said he'd be moving to another department, financial crimes. He laughed lightly and said it would be quieter. He thanked us, again, for our patience. I thanked him back. When the call ended, I stood by the window for a while, looking down at the street where delivery trucks were backing into the loading dock. Their reverse alarms echoed off the buildings, steady, identical beeps, measured like breath. The city, by then, had already filed away what had happened. The residents no longer talked about it, management no longer mentioned new policies, and life had folded back into its predictable rhythm. The violet suitcase existed now only in the form of paperwork and a faded evidence tag I no longer had. That was the entire record. An object found, cataloged, transferred, destroyed. Nothing mysterious, nothing supernatural. just a series of ordinary mistakes that happened to cross our path. When I passed the disposal enclosure at night, the new motion light came on automatically, flooding the space in white. The gate closed behind me with its usual click. The bin stood lined against the wall, labeled and empty. Everything was accounted for. The letter from the prosecutor's office was supposed to be the final one. It said everything that needed to be said. Case concluded, evidence destroyed, no further correspondence required. I read it once and placed it in the folder with the others. The drawer closed with the familiar sound of wood on metal. For a few weeks, that was it. The story had been boxed and filed away by everyone who mattered to it professionally. Life went back to its regular pattern. Morning coffee, emails, quiet dinners. The small rhythm of an apartment that had been lived in long enough to feel like an extension of its owners. Rachel started gardening again. Small pots on the balcony railing. Herbs that could survive neglect. We talked about moving. Not because we needed to, but because it felt like a good idea to have something new to focus on. The building had calmed. No more police cars, no more reporters. The disposal area outside had become just another fenced corner again. One evening, returning from work later than usual, I saw a maintenance truck parked near the enclosure. A worker stood beside it, talking into his radio. On the ground near his feet was a large black bag, sealed, tagged with orange tape. He noticed me and nodded politely. I nodded back and walked past. The air smelled of detergent and dust. The light above the gate flickered, then steadied. Nothing unusual. Inside, Rachel had the news on low volume. A brief segment mentioned that the city was conducting a review of its evidence management procedures, unrelated to any current case. It wasn't about us, but the language echoed the phrases I'd heard for months. Verify, confirm, reconcile. I sat on the couch, listened until the anchor moved on to the weather, then turned off the TV. Weeks passed. The habit of keeping records lingered. I still wrote dates in margins, repairs, bills, the start and end of small things. Rachel teased me about it once, said I was turning into a bookkeeper for our own lives. Maybe she was right. Documentation had become a kind of quiet insurance against uncertainty. One afternoon, a new maintenance manager visited the complex. He was young, wore a vest with the city logo, introduced himself with practiced friendliness. He said the city was updating storage policies and needed to verify that every unit's access key for the disposal gate was current. I handed him mine. He scanned it with a small device, checked his clipboard, and thanked me. Before leaving, he mentioned that the old evidence storage facility had been demolished the previous month. Part of modernization, he said. He smiled, professional and distant, and left. That night, I went out to the balcony for air. From there, you can see the line of dumpsters under the security light. The new enclosure looked stronger than the old one. Thicker panels, reinforced gate. I watched as a resident dropped off a broken chair, then stepped back while the gate swung shut automatically. The light turned off. The corner went dark again. In the morning, there was an envelope taped to the door from the property office. It contained updated community guidelines, mostly about recycling. I almost tossed it aside, but one page caught my eye. Under the section titled Bulky Waste Procedures, a small black and white photo illustrated proper tagging. The picture showed an old disposal site, the previous model of the enclosure. In the corner of the frame, just visible, was the violet suitcase. Upright, handle extended. I showed the page to Rachel. She looked at it briefly, then at me. "They reused an old photo," she said. I nodded. It made sense. The city reuses images for these things all the time. Still, I folded the page carefully and slid it into the folder with the others. The folder was almost too full to close now. By summer, the entire case had faded from public conversation. Lane had moved on. The courthouse files were sealed, and the building's management changed hands. The new team didn't know the history. They painted over the walls, replaced the signage, and renovated the lobby. Fresh paint smells like closure. It doesn't actually erase what happened, but it helps people behave as if it did. Sometimes, on my way out in the mornings, I'd see delivery drivers wheeling new suitcases across the sidewalk. Bright colors, shiny surfaces, everything clean and ready for use. They looked lighter than ours had, even when full. It's strange what you notice after something like that. You start measuring weight differently, not by kilograms, but by what you know about where things come from. I still have the property office's letter, the one confirming destruction. The ink is fading. The case number at the top looks like any other administrative code. If someone found it in the future, they'd have no idea what it referred to. To them, it would be another file, another routine confirmation. Every story ends with someone signing off, and this one had plenty of signatures. Detectives, clerks, technicians, both of us. The city has its own ways of turning events into paper. Once the last form is stamped, the story doesn't end. It just stops being anyone's responsibility. When I walk past the enclosure now, I don't look in. I don't need to. Whatever was left there years ago has already been recycled, processed, erased. The gate closes behind me with its usual sound. Everything looks as it should. And if there's still a faint mark on the pavement where that suitcase once stood, it's just a stain from the rain and time, nothing more. That's all for today's story. Did you enjoy it? I'll return soon with another one. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more stories.